Hi, this is Max Paquette. I'm an associate professor of biomechanics, sports scientist, coach, and avid runner.
Hello, it's Dougal Allen here, current world multisport champion and Challenge Wanaka course record holder.
Hi, I'm David Bailey. I'm the head of performance at Bahrain Victorious cycling team.
Hey, it's Eloise Wellings, and I am here with Brad discussing postpartum return to sport.
Oh, hello, I'm Dr. Ashar Khan. I'm a specialist psychiatrist who is practicing in the neuropsychiatry of ADHD and high-functioning ASD.
I'm Dr. Tania Pizzari, and I'm sitting here with almost Dr. Brady Green. Welcome to the show. You're listening to the Physical Performance Show.
Failure is not an option.
I've had my ups and my downs.
I think it's an absolutely breakthrough experience.
Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, the show designed to inspire the pursuit of your physical best performance. I'm your host, Brad Beer. Listen in as we delve into how the world's top physical performers achieve their success, as well as the highs, the lows, and the journey of getting there. Let's get ready, set, let's go. Welcome to episode 291 of the Physical Performance Show, brought to you by Polar's world-leading GPS watches and heart rate monitors, our upcoming live stream event featuring Rinny McGregor fueling the endurance athlete, and the Physical Performance Show's very own Learnings membership over at Patreon. I'm Brad Beer, sports physiotherapist and exercise scientist by trade and training, and founder of Pogo Physio. Each week, we'll bring you the latest and greatest information and inspiration designed to help you perform at your physical best. And of course, we do this across a range of our different episodes, interest editions, coaches' corners, featured performers, expert editions, and our all-new Learnings Catchupasodes. And the purpose of these catch-upasodes is, as the name suggests, to allow you to catch up on some of the great moments shared by our guests each quarter, a little bit of a reflective learning exercise if you like. And hot off the back of last week's expert edition on all things knowing your carbohydrate numbers for training and racing with repeat guest of the show, Andy Blow, co-founder of Precision Hydration, you'll need your pen and paper ready again today. And up first on this Learnings Catch-Episode, we look back at Max Paquette, episode 264, Associate Professor Biomechanics at the Human Performance Center at the University of Memphis, who shared so well around moving beyond our fascination with weekly mileage. Here's a little snippet of Max sharing around how and why it is that our body doesn't know how far we've gone or how hard we've gone, but rather it understands how we're feeling. So therefore, can we really call running mileage training load? I've heard you say that your body doesn't know how fast or how far it's going or gone, but it does know how it's feeling. And I think when we think about that statement that you've shared previously, it makes sense. Yet, as runners, the community, there's been this long-held obsession, which you write about in the paper you reference, with distance and mileage. Can you speak to where that obsession's come from and how and why things now need to start to change to consider the fact that we need to think about how the body's feeling?
Yeah, I think the human nature is to simplify things, right? We're always trying to find a way to do as little as possible and understand as much as possible in a way, right? And so we use mileage in running. It's been used for as long as distance running has been a thing, I suppose. And it gets to a point where we get so comfortable with the term and we understand it. It's so simple and we relate to it and we can quantify it even. We can see it. We know how far a mile is. So it becomes very ingrained and simple to use this. And, then it starts to trickle down, that some top athletes will use, I run 80 miles a week or 60 miles a week. And then you see time and time again, younger athletes, high school, even college, who are really see or trying to achieve these distances in training, and they use them almost as milestones, right? Oh, my first 80-mile week or my first whatever. And there's value in training volume or training distance. There's certainly value there, but I think the idea that we can call mileage running training load is just it's just so misleading, I think, in terms of really knowing what's happening to the athlete. And again, I think it's just culture, time. It's been something that's been done for a long time, and it's really difficult to change that. And so I do feel hopeful that a lot of conversations have been had now around this topic the last decade or so, especially in distance running. And cycling, it's been around for much longer in team sports. But in running, I think things are moving in the right direction. And I think that's going to help a lot of coaches and even athletes understand their bodies a bit better and plan things a bit better.
You mentioned there, Max, that to only speak in the metric of distance or volume, whilst, as you suggested or inferred there, Max, volume does have a place. It is a training variable that, when manipulated, can have outcomes on performance, but that it can be misleading. Can you just unpack that a little bit more? Misleading in what sense?
Yeah, sure. I think the best example I always use, you compare two athletes, right? Well, there's two examples I can use. The first one is comparing two different athletes, and the next one is comparing the same athlete over time. So let's start with, let's say you and I are training together, and we have the same coach, and the coach both gives us both, let's say, a prescription of 50 miles to run for week 1, and then 60 miles, and 70 miles weeks 2 and 3. Well, for a number of factors, which could be having stressful academic life, or stressful clinical life, hosting podcasts and being up late or early, those types of things. And then, of course, the way that you run, your mechanics, nutrition, sleep, so on and so forth. For some reason, the 50 miles in the first week might be very easy for me, but for whatever reason, it affects you the wrong way, right? It puts you in a training hole, as we might call it. But the coach is seeing on the paper 50 miles for both of us, right? So there's no differentiation. And then the next week is the assumption that the 50 miles has had the same effect on both athletes, and you move on to 60 miles. And now what you do is you just continue digging a hole. Now, this is a very specific case where the coach might not be communicating with athletes very clearly or very often. And this happens very regularly with online coaching now and big groups. If you're a professional coach or a high school coach, even with a small group of athletes, that's a lot easier to prevent because you might see the athlete every day. And you have this sort of ongoing conversation and communication about, how the athlete is responding to the training. And so ultimately, distance alone doesn't actually tell the coach or the coach mostly, how the athlete is responding to the training, right? So that's example one, two people, same training. The second example is having the same athlete over time. And you might say, you're going to run 50 miles for 3 weeks. That's going to be a steady 3-week block, right? So you have 50, 50, 50. And the coach assumes that each week is doing the same thing to the athlete. And again, for a number of reasons, it might not. And so you come out of the block thinking, okay, this was 3 low weeks, assuming that this was 50 miles was low for that particular athlete. But on the other end, the outcome is not what was prescribed or anticipated anyway. So those are the two examples that I would say describe it the most easily, is that you don't really know what the athlete, how the athlete responds to that.
So if you missed Max Paquette, episode 264, do jump back for a wealth of knowledge that was shared. Now, next up on our Learnings Catchupasode, we're revisiting episode 269's featured performer, Dougal Allen, multi-sport champion and head coach of DA Endurance. This was a very popular episode, and one of the highlights from Dougal's share-ins was his top 3 tips for mastering psychology for athletes. Dougal reflected on these 3 tips as his 3 Ps, being process-focused, being patient, and being persistent. Enjoy.
I'm not a psychologist, obviously, so I'm a little bit shy saying this because you'll have some sports psychs that will listen to this. But from an experience point of view, certainly number 1, without doubt, is to be process focused. And it's so easy to say, it's so hard to actually follow through on. My best races have come literally when I've nailed that aspect of my psychology leading into and during the event. And so how that looks really in real terms is being in the moment, focusing on what needs to happen here and now. If I'm on my bike, it might be keeping good smooth pedaling circles, staying down nice and aero. It's got nothing to do with the guy that's 5 minutes up the road. It's got nothing to do with the fact we've got a headwind, but then when we turn, we've got a tailwind. I've got no control over the weather or the other competitors. And so being process focused, I guess, is number one.
Yep.
Number two, I think, applies probably a little more broadly, but it's just to be patient. And it just really, it probably relates a little bit to that process thing, but I have conversations with younger athletes and it's amazing how much they want to happen right now. But there's something beautiful about just having a patient approach to the sport. And even on race day, my coast to coast this year, I didn't lead the race until 10 hours into the 11-hour race. And in hindsight, I was so proud of how patient I'd been in trusting my plan. So patience. Yeah. And so thinking out loud here now, because number 1 and 2 came pretty effortlessly.
So we've got number 1, stay process focused, be in the moment. You gave that great example of not being able to control the weather, not being able to control the headwind, tailwind. Can't certainly control your competitors. Number 2, be patient. You gave the great example there, Dougal, of the coast to coast win most recently, not taking the lead until 10 hours into an 11-hour race. And the third top psychological tip to get the most out of your performance.
Yeah, I could almost call this my 3 Ps, because the third word, which we've already talked about, is perspective. And I really liked, forgive me for not remembering the surname, Rory. What was Rory's?
Rory Darkins, positive psychology researcher, Sydney-based, former expert edition.
Loved his podcast, listened to it 3 times, shared it on my closed Facebook group with my athletes. They all gave me heaps of good feedback about that podcast. So if Rory's listening, thank you so much for your insights. But I think perspective is a good one. And he used different words to describe it, I think, but I really like the way he created perspective around things like, are the competitors, are they a threat, or are they an enabler to me as in pursuit of my own goals and my own performance? And so, just keeping a perspective around why you do the sport, what you truly want to take from your involvement in the sport. Because I guarantee if you start to peel the layers of the onion back further and further and further and really start to look into the why as to what brought you to your involvement in sport, it's actually got very little to do with results. It's so much more around what you value and who you want to be in life. And Richie McCaw, again in the God Zone, at one stage, we must have been pretty sleep deprived because we got pretty deep and meaningful here, but he said, what 3 words would you want people to use at your funeral? Which sounded a bit morbid when he asked it, but as we sort of hiked our way through the mountains and had hours to think and answer his question, the words that came to mind for me were things like integrity. They had nothing to do with being a successful athlete. So perspective.
So if you missed episode 269 with Dougal Allen, do jump back for a whole lot of highs, lows and learn-ins. Now, next up on our Learn-ins Catch-Upasode, we revisit episode 273's guest, featured performer and repeat guest of the show, Eloise Wellings, 3 times Australian 10,000 metre champion and dual Olympian, who is part of our week-to-week, month-long Postpartum Return to Sport series. And I asked Eloise her top tips for fueling running mums postpartum. But here's the catch. Eloise's wonderful advice pertains not only to women postpartum with their return to running, but all athletes would do well to heed Elsie's advice. This is, for me, as a clinician, an area of great challenge. How does the breastfeeding mother meet the energy demands of that, plus normal physiological daily processes, plus training? It's hard to quantify. It's a bit of guesswork. It's a tricky thing to navigate. But what would be your top tip around fueling postpartum, Elsie?
like when I was breastfeeding, I was always hungry. And then when I weaned Sonny, which was when he was 12 months old, I was still training, obviously, but then I stopped breastfeeding and I just didn't feel as hungry. And so I wasn't eating as much as when I was breastfeeding, and I probably didn't get that balance right. I think just eating for training, eating for recovery, and just allowing yourself to fuel as you would a car, and making sure that you're getting enough energy. And I mean, the things about, it's one of the precursors to bone injuries is low energy availability. And so, if you're getting a lot of bone stress injuries, then you definitely want to cover that base and to make sure that you're fueling yourself properly, you're meeting your energy demands and more. And I wouldn't be afraid of staying. I mean, if you're the type of athlete that competes, I wouldn't be afraid of being heavier. And if you've got a ideal race weight that you're at, for me, I try and stay a little bit heavier year round, and I choose 1 or 2 races when I get to that race weight, that ideal race weight, and I don't stay there very long. And there's a discipline to that, because you feel really, really good for a short amount of time because you're light and you're lean, and but it's, I would say, near impossible to stay that lean without getting sick or injured for a long time. And so it's really important, after those 1 or 2 races that I've chosen in the year, that I go back to train what I call my training weight, which is, a couple of kilos heavier than my racing weight. And the other key indicator for me is just making sure that I'm getting my period. That to me is a true sign of health. The fact that your body is not shutting down each month to focus on just surviving, and your body is ready to reproduce at any time is a key sign of health. And every time I get my period each month, I'm like, yay, it's a sign of health. It's not always yay, but it's like I have a backache and a headache, but this is awesome because I'm healthy and I'm, I know that I'm strong and healthy enough and my body knows what to do. I think that if that's not happening, then that could be a sign that, there's low energy availability, and, it might be an idea to go and see a dietitian or a nutritionist or a psychologist if that's something that you're struggling with, to go and address those issues and make sure that you're just fueling your body properly.
Always a show pleaser, Eloise Wellings. If you miss episode 273, do jump back for, as always, a very honest and transparent insight from one of Australia's great endurance athletes. You're listening to this, a Learnings Catchupasode, here on the Physical Performance Show. As you know, the Physical Performance Show exists to help you perform at your physical best, and therefore we couldn't be more excited to announce our new show partner, Polar. Polar are a sports technology company who build world-class GPS watches and heart rate monitors for people who take their health, fitness, and sports performance seriously. Polar have an incredible heritage. Headquartered in Finland, they have been the global driving force behind scientific wearables for over 40 years. They are the pioneers in and the world leaders in heart rate measurement technology, providing you with the best 24/7 monitoring. When you're training to reach a specific goal, the key is to balance between training and rest, as we know. The number one reason we see athletes getting injured and not being at their best is a training load error. Polar's products allow you to find your training sweet spot so you can be as productive as possible. With Polar's GPS sports watches, you can get access to their feature called Training Load Pro. This gives you an always-on daily view of the relative load of your training, including your personal feedback on how demanding your training sessions have been. From your wrist, you'll then be able to always see what you need to do to nail your training and stay away from warning signs that lead to undertraining, overtraining, injuries once and for all. Worn by many of the best athletes on the planet, you too can now know your numbers and find your own training sweet spot and therefore your best performance. Now, as a starting bonus, the team at Polar are offering up to 15% off. So if it's time for you to nail your racing and training, then jump over to polar.com and use the code TPPS for selected products. Support for today's show also comes from our upcoming live stream event, Fueling the Endurance Athlete, with acclaimed UK sports dietitian Rinny McGregor. This will be a learning opportunity not to miss, taking place Saturday, the 23rd of October, 3 to 6 p.m. Brisbane, Australian Eastern Standard Time. However, if you are outside of that time zone, as so many of our worldwide audience will be, rest assured we'll be granting all registrants to the live stream complete access to the recording and the live stream notes following the live stream event. Tickets are available from 49 Australian dollars over at pogophysio.com.au/Rinny McGregor live stream, or jump over to the Instagram bio link for the Physical Performance Show. And finally, support for today's show comes from the Physical Performance Show's very own Learnings membership. It's simple. If you'd like to support the production of the show from just $5 per month, you can do so simply by jumping over to Patreon, search for the Physical Performance Show, and in return, we'll grant you complimentary access to our back catalogue of live stream events and our upcoming live stream events, including prior mentioned live stream with Rinny McGregor, Fueling the Endurance Athlete. For now, let's jump back with this week's Catchupasode and continue the learnings revision. And next up, we take a look back at episode 275, Expert Edition guest, Dr. David Bailey, Head of Performance at Team Bahrain Victorious World Professional Cycling, who shared so well around high performance in the cycling peloton. But the takeaways, the learnings were not just applicable to the sport of cycling, but all sports performance, particularly endurance. And one of the highlights of David's share-ins was when David debunked the misunderstanding that exists around this concept of marginal gains. We so often hear the concept of marginal gains referenced as part of an athlete or a team's preparations to get the best out of themselves. So it was very insightful to hear David set the record straight on what the concept of marginal gains truly means. David, you're in a sport that certainly the marketers, the commercial side of it, drives the concept of marginal gains and 1%ers and, faster bike. And former featured expert on the show, Phil Burt, who has shared around bike fitting. Phil gave the great example of a recreational athlete looking at their time trial position. A time trial setup, they'll not hold back on spending on a time trial bike, but oftentimes overlooking their position on the bike or, their body themselves. You've got a great passion for debunking some of the myths around this concept of marginal gains. Can you just speak to this? Obviously, it must be frustrating at times and amusing at others.
I think perhaps debunking is probably the wrong word. I think it's a misunderstanding more than anything else. I think that the term was coined when I was at British Cycling, and at the time it was called aggregation of marginal gains, so implying that there was an accumulative effect. And you only have to go out and look at some of the stuff on sports nutrition that's added caffeine and creatine and bicarbonate, and you don't see a cumulative effect. There might be 4% gains individually, but it doesn't add up to 12. And that's because there's diminishing returns, and a lot of that depends on the individual. So I think it's you have to first of all accept that it's human nature to explain performance and explain things in general, unifactorially. That happened because of this. This guy won that race because of that. And of course, the people who have got some financial gain from endorsing that jump on it, whether it's bike companies, clothing companies, sports nutrition, some individual that's had some input, rehabilitation, yes, it was because of this. And I get it, why wouldn't you? Because that's how the world works these days. It's a little less looking into the process, a little bit more what the outcome is. But that will come back and bite you in the ass because, that doesn't happen consistently. So for me, the concept of marginal gains is quite simple. It's performance is multifactorial. So it makes sense to break it down into its margins. And Sir Dave Brailsford of Ineos, has been misquoted multiple times on that. He's always stated that it's, that's what we do. We look at performance, we break it down, and then we invest resource into those which we believe bring the biggest marginal return. which is a fundamental model in business, right? It's like, they break down what are their margins of costs and profitability in a business, and you invest in those that give you the biggest return. But human nature thinks a margin is 1 or 2%. It can be upwards of 20%. So I really drive people's thinking to say, okay, well, at the end of the day, we can quantify performance to some extent. Once we've done that, we've broken it down into the genetics of the athlete, their trainability, their nutrition strategy, their aerodynamics, their mindset. We can go on all day here. Where people miss that step now, and this is where it needs to go, but the commercial sector won't endorse it, is to say, well, now wait that. How important is that guy's chain lubrication versus his altitude training camp? And you can't give it to the 1%, but you come away hopefully with a bunch of factors that are really fundamental marginal gains, yeah? And then there are probably a bunch of factors that are moderate, and then there are ones that are just the sort of icing on the cake, if you like. And I think you find a lot of the icing on the cake ones are the ones that make the headlines, because it's a nice story, it's got some marketing behind it, and I think that's fine, I get that, but I think if you're trying to help an individual improve their performance, then you have to not disregard the baking of the cake, those fundamental core marginal gains before you start putting the icing on it. And then one caveat to that is the placebo effect. You can't disregard that, especially in sport where psychology is such a fundamental performance factor in itself. So it might be that some of these marginal gains, these icing on the cakes, are important, whether it be, the Super Sapiens device or some new aero bars or a sports supplement. If you get that right with its implementation, you can almost double or triple its effect because of the placebo effect. So if the person feels like they're getting an advantage from it because it's a new thing, other people don't get access to it, it's been pitched to them in the right way, whether they're someone who's receptive to scientific evidence or whether they're just someone who trusts in the expertise around them. When I was with some teams, we would never let them use the full race setup in training. We'd only let them use it in the race on the basis that it would add to the placebo effect, where I've been at other organizations like, well, why wouldn't we use the full race setup in training race simulation? Because it's good to practice it. Now, there's no right or wrong answer there. It's just about understanding of that placebo effect. And I think if you can add that to the understanding of how you weight your performance factors, then you get more bang for your buck.
Now, that was just one of many of the gems that Dr. David Bailey shared. So if you happen to have missed episode 275, you know what to do. Get your pen and paper ready for a bucket load of learn-ins. Now, next up on our Learn-ins Catch-Upasode, we caught up with the dynamic duo from La Trobe Sport and Exercise Medicine's Research Centre, Dr. Tania Pizzari and Brady Green, who shared some wonderful knowledge and learn-ins around all things calf strain rehabilitation. Now, most of us will have experienced or will experience a calf strain at some point. As a sports physiotherapist myself, I certainly enjoyed and geeked out on lots of the share-ins from Dr. Tania Pizzari and Brady Green. It was a very popular episode because it affects all of us. So if you want to know how to both prevent and do the best treatment approach for calf strains, then this was an expert edition not to miss. And here's Brady and Tania discussing why the mechanism of injury is so important for directing treatment, but also for your prognosis post a calf strain. Mechanism of injury, Brady and Tania. I certainly had this wrong throughout my early years of my professional clinical career, where I expected every calf strain that ever occurred to have an acute mechanism of injury. And known, did you feel a twang or did you feel it go? Yeah. And I pridefully could put my hand up after 30 years of running and say up until the last 2 years I'd never had a calf strain, but I'm quite happy to have had one because I was surprised it was nothing more than a feeling of tightness that at the end of the run then eventuated into a distinct feeling of soreness. So can you speak to the mechanism of injury and any mistaken beliefs around how calf strains need to come on?
With Brady's research with the AFL data, we certainly found that it was around half or just over half of the injuries occurred with no inciting event, so that they just felt it was a gradual onset or they couldn't remember anything happening in the game, basically. So that was much more likely with soleus injuries. So over half of the 184 injuries that we looked at were actual just sort of gradual onset or nothing that they could recall. So that's, exactly what you're talking about, Brad. So nothing going ping. And look, the majority were felt kind of after the game. So post-game, they felt a bit sore, something wasn't quite right. So it wasn't necessarily even something that stopped them during the game, but it was after the game that they reported some tightness and then, subsequently get a scan or, have a clinical assessment, and it identified that they actually had a calf strain injury.
And we can theorise why this might be the case in that potentially the really high proportion of slow twitch fibres in the soleus may be prone to cumulative failure, and that it's almost a cumulative or evolving pathology in a different way than, say, a rectus femoris strain during kicking or a biceps femoris strain during sprinting. So potentially the structure of the soleus is one reason for that injury pattern. There's also really complex innervation to particularly the deep posterior lower leg, and that could result in just a different perception of symptoms and also a different threshold that we start to perceive discomfort and how that localises over time versus some of our other commonly injured muscles, which tend to be in more superficial compartments of the lower limb. So potentially an impact of the structure, the innervation could lead to that pattern for soleus. But of course, gastrocnemius, it's almost always a different situation. You strain your gastrocnemius, when it's happened, you've been accelerating, jumping, generally doing something really with high intensity and a speed component. And often there's a combined knee extension and rapid dorsiflexion where the strains occurred. And again, gastrocnemius is a almost exclusively fast twitch muscle compared to soleus, and that fits the picture with how we see and how other muscle strain injuries present.
So that's really key information for not just the practitioner in the field, but also the everyday recreationally competitive or elite runner in terms of that important bit of the history. Did you feel it acutely during an event or training session, or was it more of a subtle onset after? Yeah.
And this can potentially have prognostic implications as well, where we evaluated time to return to play post-calf strain. And overall, in our first study, injuries that occurred during running-related mechanisms, so the athlete's well aware of how it happened and when it happened at a particular point in time, they have a significantly longer time to return to play than athletes who presented with no specific inciting event. So that's potentially a really useful clinical piece of information, regardless of whether you have MRI available to you or not, that there's a prognostic difference based on how the calf strain presents.
So longer recovery time if you did feel an acute...
Yeah. And simply put, if somebody's telling you, I accelerated and I felt my calf pop and I could barely walk, that seems to be different to I pulled up a bit tight after I ran, the tightness hung around and didn't go away for a few days, and then when I tried to run again, it was still there and I had to stop running after a kilometre or so.
So if you missed episode 276, do jump back with your pen and paper. It's one for athletes, practitioners, and the sports scientists, clarifying such an important topic. And finally, on this Learnings Catch-Upasode, we revisit episode 280's expert edition guest, Dr. Ashar Khan, specialist psychiatrist at the Queensland ADHD and Neurosciences Clinic, who explored a topic that impacts so many: ADHD, exercise and sport. Following this episode, I received a lot of feedback about the impact that Dr. Khan's sharings made. It's believed that the prevalence of ADHD may be up to 18% amongst the elite athlete community, and I dare say even greater amongst all athletic people. I certainly took a lot from this episode recording myself. As I mentioned at the time of the recording, my mouth was open on the desk as Dr. Khan shared. And one of the learnings that really hit home was this distinction between being addicted to exercise versus displaying addictive behaviour towards exercise. Now, I suspect many people listening in will either know or themselves may have had someone in their world reference that they are addicted to exercise. Yet, as Dr. Khan shared, to the individual with an ADHD brain, exercise is akin to breathing. It is every bit as important to the person with ADHD in regulating their mood and functioning. And as you'll hear Dr. Khan quip, who would ever say that they're addicted to surviving? Something that I feel, just knowing you personally, you've almost edified me around is my absolute love of exercise and the need to survive with it largely. And it brings up something that I often hear in my work, and that is people being almost criticised for their seeming, they might even say, I cop a bit of flack because I'm addicted to exercise. And they almost feel some sense of shame around it. Speaking to people like you over the years, which has been a real blessing, it's you've helped me as a therapist, practitioner, physio, realise that, well, this can be people's sustenance through life, and it is not to be poo-pooed for for individuals. So, I mean, anything you'd share around that, just liberating the person that maybe thinks, this is a bad thing, I can't stop doing this.
Absolutely. I mean, but you can't, because there is... as I said to you, you're on autopilot. I mean, our mind-brain-body connections are driven by some evolutionary, some genetics, some socially reinforced, some environmental. We are regulated beings, and we have to survive. And so the brain will make you survive. You run, and your heart rate does come down. Your blood pressure does settle. Your breathing rate does go to 12 to 17 a minute, no matter if it's 36, 2 minutes before. So our brain is constantly regulating ourselves. And that's why exercise, one of the best studies is that when they started looking at the role of sports and exercise was they looked at the impact on the vagal nerve, stimulation and conditioning. And they found, exercise, the cord or the wiring that it is connected or plugged in is through the vagal nerve. So vagal nerve is the regulatory nerve, heart rate, cardiovascular, you know the deal, right? Breathing. So exercise is an essential component, ADD or not ADD. I've given you enough evidence today to show its impact on ADD brains, but also non-ADD brains. There's no way that you're going to miss out. But when it comes to ADD, that addictive part that comes in is actually perhaps sustained by a brain trying to salvage your quality of life, giving you adaptive survival skills, allowing you to stay and evolve, because it's the way we are tuned. Right? And so, I mean, the brain has its own right and wrongs. It has the two parts. One is the logical part, and the other part is the contextual part, which gives you perspective. Without these two talking, you won't have purpose, you won't have values, you won't have goals. So the brain is an amazing piece of, 1 to 3 billion wires, and it's constantly doing it. So that addictive capacity is not the addiction that we see. So when ADD people come to me and say, I've been drinking and to regulate myself, or cannabis and whatnot, or workaholism or gambling or pornography, I say to them, that's addictive behavior. That's not addiction as a disease. And they're branded all over the hospitals and everywhere else as addicts, but they're not. But just because it's sports, they won't be branded as addicts because it's a good thing. So part of that addictive behavior is your self-survival, as it is mine to get up and eat or breathe, okay? And so it could be looked at as having an addictive quality. Yes. But then basically you're saying, I'm addicted to surviving, which is kind of,
a good thing.
Yes, it's the most normal thing that you have.
I think you've liberated many listeners out there, Ashar. Thanks, Dr. Ashar Khan. If you missed that one, jump back, episode 280, with your pen and paper for a bucket load of learnings around such an important topic. Talking about jumping back, if you missed last week's episode, it featured repeat guest of the show, Andy Blow, co-founder of Precision Hydration, who shared around knowing your carbohydrate, training and fueling numbers. Here's a little snippet from Andy's share-ins.
Because gels, effectively, if you, no pun intended, boil it down, a energy gel is a carbohydrate drink with a lot of the water taken out. But it's a more viscous drink because it's so concentrated. So the energy gel that we make is about 50 grams, about 50 millilitres in volume, and it contains 30 grams of carbs. The energy drink that we do is 30 grams of carbs in 500 millilitres. So it's about 10 times more concentrated in a gel. That makes it really easy to carry, more portable, and you can obviously get more calories, more bang for your buck. And gels, as most people listening will know, are the most versatile and easily digestible way of getting carbs in for most events. So there's not many events you can't use a gel.
As always, you'll find the show over on all of the podcast players and also YouTube. So if you missed Andy Blow's sharings, jump back and get onto that one as well. So there you have it, another episode of the Physical Performance Show, and I trust you enjoyed a little bit of a revision session. We really do drink from a fire hose each and every week with our generous guest share-ins, so I hope you're enjoying this quarterly discipline of taking a little look back. Now coming up, you're in for some real treats on the Physical Performance Show next week. It's a bumper one. It's dual Olympic triathlon champion, perhaps the GOAT, the greatest of all time in the sport of triathlon, Alastair Brownlee. This interview has been worked on since 2017, and you'll hear from Alastair around his career highs, lows, and learnings from an athlete that has rewritten the history books. Hot off the heels of Alastair Brownlee, we catch up with repeat guest of the show, Professor Belinda Beck, for a look at preventing bone stress injuries in junior athletes. But as always, before we go, a massive thank you to the great folk who make this show possible each and every week. Daryl Misson, our audio engineer, Susan Wilkin on all things show administration, and Matthew Olding on all things show graphic design. If you'd like to support the production of the show and receive access to our upcoming and back catalogued live stream events, please consider supporting the show over at Patreon and become a Learnings member from just $5 per month. And a huge thank you to our new show patrons, Pierre Muner and Jaden Halkat, for your support of the show. Thank you, Pierre and Jadan. Lastly, if you're enjoying the show, do consider a review over on iTunes. They are always very encouraging to read and at times very helpful in terms of feedback. Alternately, you can reach me b.beer@pogophysio.com.au with any feedback on how to improve the show, perhaps a guest that you'd like to hear from. So until next week, keep pursuing your physical best performance. I'm Brad Beer, and this has been the Physical Performance Show.